Certain papers exist that should remain concealed forever. Once discovered, they reveal horrors that fundamentally alter one's understanding of the world. This is the account of such a discovery. A record book, modest in appearance, bound in aged leather, and filled with columns of names, numerical entries, and dates. At first glance, it resembled any ordinary plantation inventory log tracking goods and expenditures. Yet this particular volume was deliberately concealed within a false compartment inside a locked writing desk situated in a chamber where access was strictly forbidden. When it finally came to light on a sweltering afternoon in August 1854, its contents proved far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. The information contained within placed lives at risk and would eventually force individuals to escape under cover of darkness. Influential figures would resort to violence to prevent its exposure. This was no simple record of events. It documented deliberate actions and identified those who suffered because of them. The august heat created shimmering distortions above the dusty Louisiana road, making the landscape appear to ripple like water over glass. Elias Thorne pressed a thoroughly dampened handkerchief to his face, though it provided little relief from the oppressive humidity that seemed to penetrate everything during the late summer months. His transport vehicle jolted along the rutted pathway, wooden wheels protesting with each impact, sending up clouds of fine dust that settled onto his dark wool jacket like an additional layer of fabric. His journey had consumed 3 full days, 72 hours from his position as a bookkeeper with the Carmichael Shipping Company in Richmond. 3 days to arrive at this isolated corner of Louisiana where massive cypress trees grew so densely that sunlight struggled to penetrate their thick canopy, and the atmosphere carried the scent of decomposition and saturated earth. 3 days to reach the property known as Belre plantation, a French phrase meaning beautiful dream. Yet as the main residence emerged through the corridor of ancient oak trees draped with hanging moss, Elias thought it resembled something conjured by fever rather than pleasant slumber. The columns that once gleamed white were now stained with patches of mildew. Paint hung from the shutters in long curling fragments. Wild vegetation pushed through the brick walkway leading to the main entrance. The driver, a weathered individual who had spoken barely 10 words during their entire journey, confirmed this was indeed Belre, the former home of the deceased Dr. Alistair Dubois. The word deceased hung heavily between them. 6 weeks had passed since the doctor's death, officially attributed to a horseback riding accident. According to correspondence Elias had received from the estate's legal representative, Dr. Dubois had been thrown from his mount during a morning ride and struck his head fatally on a stone boundary marker. The estate required someone to organize the deceased's financial documentation and prepare a comprehensive accounting for the inheritors. A former colleague who had worked with Dubois during his medical practice in New Orleans had recommended Elias for this assignment. The attorney's letter promised quick work, 2 weeks at most, with generous compensation equivalent to 3 months' regular salary. Given his mother's constant need for medical care in Richmond and the barely adequate income from his bookkeeping position, Elias couldn't refuse. Still, as he descended from the carriage and felt his boots sink into the soft, damp soil, an uncomfortable sensation tightened in his stomach, an instinctive warning urging him to return to the carriage and depart immediately. He dismissed the feeling. Crud. Before he could knock, the front entrance opened to reveal a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes resembling fragments of slate. He wore the practical attire of a property overseer, rough cotton shirt, worn leather vest, and boots caked with dried mud. His voice carried a harsh, gravelly quality as he identified himself as Silas Croft, the property manager for the past 15 years under Dr. Dubois. Elias stepped into an entrance hall that smelled of mildew combined with something sweet yet rotten, like overripe fruit. Wallpaper peeled from the walls and brown water stains darkened the ceiling. A grand staircase curved upward to the second level, its railing covered in undisturbed dust. Croft explained that all necessary materials, papers, ledgers, correspondence were located in the doctor's upstairs study. When Elias inquired about household accounts, Croft curtly stated everything was in the study. He indicated Elias would stay in the east wing, with meals served at 7 in the morning and 6 in the evening, adding a warning not to wander the grounds after dark due to uneven paths and sinkholes near the cypress groves. The warning carried an ominous weight. Following Croft up the groaning staircase, Elias noticed a dark stain on the landing wall at chest height, appearing as though something had been removed, perhaps a painting, though the outline was irregular. When he asked about it, Croft responded without turning that a mirror had broken during the funeral, and broken mirrors brought bad luck. They proceeded down a dim hallway lined with closed, silent doors. At the corridor's end, Croft unlocked a heavy oak door and announced this was the doctor's study. The room exceeded Elias's expectations in size, with bookshelves packed with leather-bound volumes covering 3 walls. A massive desk dominated the central space, its surface buried under papers, books, and correspondence. More papers were stacked on the floor. A filing cabinet stood in one corner, its drawers slightly ajar. The window behind the desk overlooked fields stretching toward a dark tree line in the distance. Croft stated that Elias would have complete privacy, that no one would disturb him. When Elias asked about household staff, Croft's voice sharpened, explaining there was no household staff anymore. Doctor, Dubois had lived alone in his final years, and Croft managed only the field operations. Meals would be brought from Croft's quarters. He instructed Elias to complete his work and stay out of the way, then departed, his boots echoing down the hallway. Alone in the study, Elias drew a slow breath. The atmosphere felt heavy and oppressive. He opened the window hoping for a breeze, but the outside air was equally still and thick. The work proved exactly as anticipated. Tedious, meticulous, and time-consuming. Dr. Dubois appeared to have been a man of obsessive organization in certain areas and complete disorder in others. The plantation's financial records were immaculate, with every expense logged and every purchase documented, receipts dating back 20 years filed chronologically in labeled folders. However, his personal correspondence was chaotic, with letters stuffed randomly into drawers. Some opened, others not, bills of sale mixed with personal notes, medical journals stacked atop legal documents. Elias spent his first day simply categorizing everything. By evening, his back ached from hunching over the desk and his eyes burned from reading faded handwriting by lamplight. A young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, brought his dinner without speaking, set the tray on a side table, and departed without acknowledging his thanks. The meal was simple: cornbread, beans, salted pork. As he ate mechanically, his mind continued processing what he'd found. The records showed declining profits over the past decade, with portions of property sold off and the workforce significantly reduced. Several structures had been demolished. Most troubling were large unexplained expenses, payments to New Orleans suppliers with no description, just amounts, some quite substantial, and payments to individuals identified only by initials, like to RC for consultation, $300, or to JM for discretion, $500. The word discretion struck him as particularly odd. As darkness fell completely, the room grew colder despite the summer heat. Around 10 o'clock, he heard a faint, rhythmic sound, thump, 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 coming from below or beside. It was difficult to determine in the old house, where sound traveled strangely through the walls. He paused, listening. The sound stopped. He moved to the door and opened it to find the hallway dark, all lamps extinguished, no light visible under any doors. The silence seemed complete. Then, just as he was about to close the door, he heard the creak of weight on old floorboards coming from down the hall. He called out, but received no response. Then came footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from him toward the stairs. He grabbed a lamp and stepped into the hallway, calling for Mr. Croft. The footsteps stopped. Holding the lamp high, he could see perhaps 10 feet ahead while the rest remained in shadow. At the staircase, he looked down into the empty entrance hall. He told himself it was just an old house making normal sounds, though he didn't quite believe it. He returned to the study and this time locked the door. 3 days into his work, Elias had organized most of the doctor's financial records and was preparing his report. The estate was solvent, but not prosperous. After settling debts and selling remaining assets, the heirs would receive a modest inheritance. However, the unexplained expenses continued to trouble him. Hundreds of dollars over 5 years, all vaguely described or undescribed, representing a significant portion of the estate's expenditures. He needed to account for every dollar. He began searching more carefully through the desk drawers for receipts or invoices that might explain these transactions. That's when he noticed the discrepancy. The desk had 6 drawers total, 3 on each side, but when he measured the depth of the drawers against the desk itself, something was wrong. The bottom right drawer wasn't as deep as it should be. He removed it completely and ran his fingers along the back panel, feeling it move slightly. Pressing harder, he heard a soft click as the panel popped forward about an inch. Behind it was a space approximately 6 inches deep, and inside was a book. He lifted it carefully. It was bound in dark leather, about the size of a standard ledger, with worn covers and frayed edges. No title or markings appeared on the outside. He carried it to the desk and opened it. The first page was blank. The second page bore a single line in neat, precise handwriting. Private record. A Dubois, not for external review. He turned to the third page and felt the room's temperature seem to drop. It was a table with columns and rows organized like any bookkeeper's ledger, but the contents were disturbing. The columns were labeled name, date of acquisition, age at acquisition, initial assessment, treatment protocol, outcome, and date of disposition. There were 37 entries, 37 rows, 37 names. His eyes moved down the first column: Cecile, Eschen, Antone, Josiah, Deline, Marie, Claire, Baptist, Simeon, Hilaire, all first names only. The second column showed dates ranging from 1839 to 1853. The third column listed ages from 8 to 41. His hands trembled as he read the fourth column, initial assessment. The first entry for Cecile, age 19, acquired April 1839, stated, subject presents in good general health, strong constitution, suitable for extended trials, cooperative temperament. The fifth column, treatment protocol, noted for Cecile, protocol 7, 3 cycles, observation period 14 months. The sixth column, outcome, read, terminated February 1841, specimen preserved. Detailed notes in Journal 3. Elias felt his stomach turn at the phrase, specimen preserved. He forced himself to read the next entry. Eschen, age 23, acquired August 1839. Initial assessment, subject shows signs of previous malaria infection. Interesting case for recovery trials resistant to instruction. Treatment protocol, Series B Protocol 4, single extended trial. Single extended trial. Observation 8 months. Outcome, expired April 1840. Unusual complications. See Journal 4 for complete documentation. The word expired struck him like a physical blow. He turned the page, his breathing shallow. More names, more dates, more clinical descriptions treating human beings like laboratory specimens. Antoine, age 30, excellent specimen, rare opportunity for cardiac study. Josiah, age 15, young subject, ideal for developmental protocols. Deline, age 28, childbearing age, suitable for maternal response trials. Every single entry ended the same way: terminated, expired, deceased, disposed. Not one marked as recovered, not one marked as released. Every single person named in this ledger was dead. When he checked the dates of disposition against the plantation's financial records, they corresponded exactly to some of those unexplained payments. The payment to RC for consultation matched the date of Baptiste's death. The payment to JM for discretion matched Simeon's death. These were payments for silence, payments to dispose of bodies, payments to keep terrible secrets. Elias closed the ledger, his hands trembling. Dr. Alistair Dubois hadn't simply been a plantation owner. He'd been conducting medical experiments on human beings. This ledger was the record of every single one of his victims. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat at the desk with the ledger open before him, reading every entry, every name, every clinical description of what had been done to these people. Some entries were brief, others detailed, referencing external journals he couldn't locate in the study. Phrases like "See Journal 8 for daily observations of subjects' response to elevated mercury doses," and "Refer to Surgical Notes, Volume 2 for complete documentation of procedure," appeared throughout. One word repeated multiple times: sanctuary, apparently a location where specimens were kept and procedures performed. Elias had explored most of the main house during his first days, but had never seen anything resembling a medical facility. Where was this sanctuary? He forced himself to continue reading. Around entry 23, he noticed a change in the handwriting. The earlier entries were neat, precise, almost elegant, but starting around 1848, the writing became more hurried and erratic, with words crossed out and rewritten, margins filled with additional notes. The tone also shifted. Early entries were clinical and detached, terrible, but written with cold scientific precision. Later entries were different. The entry for Gabriel, age 16, acquired March 1851, read, "Subject resists all cooperation, requires significant physical restraint. Initial treatments prove ineffective. Subject's stubbornness is remarkable, almost admirable. Protocol adjusted to test limits of human endurance under sustained duress. This one will break. They all break eventually. Outcome. Expired August 1851. Disappointing results. The strong ones always disappoint." Refer to Journal 14. The words were colder now, more cruel, as if Dubois had stopped seeing these people as subjects and started seeing them as obstacles to break. Entry 31 for someone named Ara, age 33, acquired January 1853, stated, "This subject is unusual. She looks at me with such intelligence, such understanding. She knows what is coming. I can see it in her eyes. It makes the work more interesting. Fear without understanding is common. Flarkerby. But fear with full comprehension, that is rare, that is valuable data. Treatment protocol, extended series D multiple protocols simultaneously. This one can handle more. Outcome. Deceased September 1853. Extensive documentation available. One of the most complete studies to date. Specimen fully preserved." Elias felt sick. These weren't medical treatments or research to help anyone. This was torture dressed in scientific language. Dubois had done it for 15 years. 37 people. 37 human beings who had suffered and died. Elias knew he couldn't remain in the study any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in. He needed to get outside to think, to decide what to do with this horrifying knowledge. It was barely dawn when he left through the kitchen entrance. Morning air was cooler than expected, but still humid. Mist rose from the ground in thin wisps. He walked without direction, simply needing to move, to distance himself from that ledger locked in the desk drawer upstairs. That's when he saw her, an elderly woman, thin as a reed, with white hair pulled back in a cloth wrap. She sat on the steps of a small cabin at the field's edge, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. She looked up as Elias approached, her eyes sharp despite her age. She identified him as the bookkeeper, not asking, but stating it as fact. When he confirmed this and apologized for disturbing her, she nodded, saying she could see the house had shown him things that made sleep impossible. She gestured for him to sit, introducing herself as Audit, explaining she'd been at the plantation longer than anyone, even before Mr. Croft, though he liked to pretend otherwise. She'd been there when the property belonged to the Belre family before Dr. Dubois purchased it in 1838, which was when things started to change. When Elias asked how things changed, Audit was quiet for a moment before telling him plainly that he seemed like a decent man, so she'd be honest. He should leave as quickly as possible, finish his accounting work, and go without asking questions or looking too deeply. When he asked why, she looked at him directly and said that some soil is so poisoned nothing good can grow from it, and this soil had absorbed too much suffering. She asked if he felt it in that study, in those papers he was sorting. Elias felt his throat tighten as he asked what she knew about the doctor's work. She replied that she knew he was a cruel man who called his cruelty science, that people came to the property and never left, that there was a place where terrible things happened, and that even though the doctor was dead, his shadow still hung over Belre like a curse. When Elias quietly mentioned the sanctuary and asked if she knew where it was, Audit's hands stopped moving. She looked at him with mixed pity and fear, asking if he'd found something in the study. He confirmed he'd found a ledger, hidden with names, dozens of names. Audit whispered for mercy, setting down her bowl and pressing her hands together. She'd known he kept records, saying men like him always do, needing to document their sins as if writing them down makes them legitimate. Elias said he needed to know what happened to these people to understand the truth. Audit's laugh was bitter as she said the truth was they suffered and died. That was the only truth that mattered. When pressed about where, she whispered it was the old infirmary past the north field near the cypress grove. The building had been constructed before the doctor arrived, originally meant to care for the sick during yellow fever season, but Dubois had converted it into his private workshop. No one was allowed near it, not even Croft, as the doctor kept the only key. When Elias said he had to see it to understand what was in the ledger, Audit's voice became suddenly fierce, gripping his arm with surprising strength. She insisted that place was full of ghosts, not the chain-rattling kind, but the kind that get inside one's head and never leave. She'd seen good men go in there and come out changed, hollowed out. Elias argued that someone had to know that if he simply left and said nothing, then these people's deaths would mean nothing. They'd have disappeared without anyone caring or even knowing their names beyond the ledger. Audit studied his face for a long moment before releasing his arm. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out an old, rusted but intact key. She explained that the doctor thought he had the only one, but the man who built the infirmary had given a spare to the head cook during the Belre era, and that key had passed through various hands over the years until it reached her. When Elias asked why she had it, she answered that she knew someday someone would need to bear witness. Her eyes were wet as she revealed that her sister was in that ledger. Her name was Ara, taken in the winter of 1853. She'd told Audit she was going to the main house to clean, but never came back. The doctor said she'd run away and offered a reward for her return, but Audit had known. She knew Ara hadn't run. Elias remembered the entry. Ara, age 33, extended Series D, deceased September 1853, specimen fully preserved. He whispered an apology, but Audit told him not to be sorry but to bear witness. She asked him to go to that place, see what the doctor did, and then make sure the world knows so it wouldn't be forgotten. Before walking back into her cabin, she turned once more to explain that the sanctuary was locked from the outside because the doctor didn't want anyone wandering in, but also didn't want anyone hearing what happened inside those walls. It was far from the main house, far from the fields, hidden by trees. She advised him to go at night since Croft patrolled during the day and mustn't see him there. Then she was gone, the cabin door closing softly behind her. Elias looked down at the key in his palm, knowing what he had to do. Elias waited until well after midnight. He spent the day maintaining the appearance of normalcy, continuing with regular accounting work, eating dinner when it was brought, answering Croft's terse questions about his progress, without indicating anything had changed, though everything had changed. He'd found additional references in the financial records, purchases of medical supplies sent to an alternate property address, payments to a Charleston medical college for specialized equipment, and a regular expense labeled simply Maintenance North Facility, the north field where the cypress grove began, where the old infirmary stood. At midnight, dressed in dark clothing, he slipped out of the study. The house was silent. He moved carefully down the stairs, avoiding the steps he'd learned would creak, and exited through the kitchen door. Outside, the moonless night was absolutely dark, clouds covering the stars. He'd brought a shielded lantern found in a storage closet, opening the shade just enough to see a few feet ahead. The light seemed shockingly bright against the blackness. He moved north past the main fields where the ground was uneven and marshy in places, his boots sinking into mud. Insects sang in the darkness. Something splashed in the distance, a night bird or an animal in the swamp. After 20 minutes of careful walking, he saw it, a structure darker than the surrounding darkness, single-story, rectangular, isolated among the cypress trees with their gnarled roots breaking through the ground like skeletal fingers. The old infirmary. As Elias approached, he could see the building was larger than expected, perhaps 40 feet long, built of brick stained black by years of moisture and moss. The windows were boarded over. The heavy wooden door, banded with iron, was secured with a padlock that looked far newer than the building itself. Elias pulled out the key Audit had given him. It slid smoothly into the lock and turned with a soft click. The padlock opened. He removed it and pushed the door, which resisted at first, swollen from moisture, then gave way with a groan. The smell hit him immediately. Chemicals, decay, something sweet and nauseating underneath. He raised the lantern and stepped inside. The main room was larger than expected with a high ceiling and exposed beams, but it had been transformed into something resembling a cross between a hospital ward and a workshop. Along one wall stood shelves, dozens of them, filled with glass jars and bottles. In the lamplight, Elias could see many jars contained things preserved in liquid, organs perhaps, tissue samples. He forced himself not to look too closely. Along another wall, medical instruments were laid out on a long table like a surgeon's toolkit, scalpels, saws, clamps, devices Elias couldn't even name, all metal and leather strapped. In the room's center stood an examination table, metal with restraints at the corners, its surface covered in dark stains. Beyond that was a desk holding papers and books, more of Dubois' meticulous record-keeping. Elias moved to the desk, his stomach churning, the lantern light casting strange shadows on the walls. The papers were organized in folders, each labeled with a name: Cecile, Etienne, Antoine, Josiah, Deline, the names from the ledger. He opened the first folder, Cecile, and immediately wished he hadn't. It contained daily observations with dated entries describing treatments administered, dosages, physical responses, symptoms, written with the same clinical precision as the ledger but more detailed, much more detailed. Entries like Day 47, subject shows marked deterioration of motor function, tremors enhance persistent verbal communication increasingly difficult. Continue current protocol, and Day 89, subject non-responsive to external stimuli, respiration shallow. Reduced protocol to observe natural progression culminated in Day 124. Subject expired at approximately 3 a.m. Performed immediate autopsy. Findings: extensive damage to neurological tissue. Detailed documentation attached. Specimen preserved for long-term study. Elias closed the folder, breathing hard through his mouth to avoid the smell. He opened another, Eschen, more of the same, clinical observations of suffering, documentation of pain administered in the name of research. Phrases like, subject requires significant restraint during procedures. Vocalizations disruptive, administered sedative, insufficient dosage, increased amount, subject unconscious for 14 hours, respiratory depression noted but subject recovered. Useful data regarding tolerance levels. Another folder for Antone stated, this subject possesses remarkable resilience. Extended trial 7 to 3 weeks despite expectations of terminal outcome by day 12. Cardiovascular system shows unusual adaptation to sustained stress. Fascinating case. Prolonged observation warranted. Elias's hands shook as he set the folders down. This wasn't medicine or research. This was a man's satisfying curiosity by destroying human beings piece by piece, and he'd been doing it for 15 years in this room, this horrible place he'd called a sanctuary. Elias forced himself to continue looking to document what he was seeing, because if he ran out right now and never came back, then Audit's sister and all the others would be forgotten. On the far wall, he found more shelves holding journals, leather-bound volumes numbered sequentially from Journal 1 through Journal 18. He pulled down Journal 14, the one referenced in Gabriel's ledger entry, and opened it to read by lamplight. It was worse than the folders. Day-by-day torture described in careful detail with notes about what worked to cause maximum suffering, what broke a person's will fastest, what kept them alive longest while administering the most pain. This wasn't a doctor conducting research, but a monster documenting his cruelty. Elias felt rage rising through the nausea, a cold, hard anger that pushed back the fear. These people had suffered and died, and no one had known or cared. But he knew now, and he could make sure the world knew too. He began gathering documents, the folders, the journals. He found a canvas bag hanging on a hook, probably used to transport supplies, and filled it. He took photographs from the walls, daguerreotypes of the facility in its earlier days before Dubois had converted it. He took a small bottle from one of the shelves labeled with an unrecognizable chemical formula as proof of the supply stored there. He took one of the instruments from the table, a scalpel in a leather case, because anyone who saw it would know what kind of work had been done here. When the bag was full, he took one last look around and noticed something he'd missed, a door in the back corner partially hidden by one of the shelving units. He moved to it and pulled it open. The smell that rushed out was worse, much worse, formaldehyde and rot. He raised the lantern. It was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, and it was full of jars, dozens of them, hundreds, all labeled, all containing preserved specimens. Labels read things like cardiac tissue subject Antoine, date March 1842, renal section subject Josiah. Date October 1844, neurological sample subject line. Date June 1847. An entire wall was dedicated to these preserved pieces of human beings, trophies, evidence, proof. Elias backed out of the room, pulling the door shut. He'd seen enough, more than enough. He turned to leave and froze. Through the open front door, he saw a light, a lantern moving toward the building. Someone was coming. Elias extinguished his lantern immediately, plunging the room into darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the canvas bag tightly and moved quickly to the side of the doorway, pressing himself against the wall. The approaching light grew brighter. Footsteps on soft ground, heavy boots. A voice called out that he knew someone was in there, and they might as well come out. Silas Croft. Elias held his breath. Croft's silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by his lantern. The overseer stepped inside, raising the light to illuminate the room, speaking conversationally about how the place hadn't been opened in 6 weeks, not since the doctor died, and how the lock had been secure this whole time until tonight. He moved further into the room, scanning the shelves, the examination table, the desk, noting that either a ghost opened that lock or someone found a key they weren't supposed to have. Elias remained motionless, hidden behind Croft in shadow. Croft turned, his lantern light sweeping across Elias's position, stating that he couldn't leave without passing by him and that he could be very patient. Elias stepped forward into the light, seeing no point in hiding anymore. When asked how Croft knew he was there, the overseer explained he hadn't known for certain but had been watching him, saw how he looked coming out of the house that morning, saw him talking to the old woman, saw the questions in his eyes. He'd seen that look before on the face of every person who started to understand what happened there. Elias accused him of knowing everything, all of it, what Dubois was doing. Croft replied that he managed the property while the doctor managed his research. They each stayed in their respective domains. When Elias challenged his use of the word research, questioning if that's what he called it, Croft's expression didn't change, saying he called it what the doctor called it, and that what he thought about it wasn't his concern. Elias felt rage flooding through him again, stating that 37 people died in this place, tortured, and experimented on like animals, and Croft replied that he kept the plantation running. That was his job. Elias laughed without humor, calling him an accomplice to murder, multiple murders. Croft's voice dropped lower, more dangerous, warning him to be careful with such words, saying he was making accusations he couldn't prove. Elias held up the canvas bag, declaring he could prove all of it. He had the doctor's records, his journals, documentation of every experiment, every victim, every death. Croft looked at the bag, then back at Elias, stating they had a problem. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Croft demanded the bag, saying if Elias gave it to him, they could forget this happened. He'd finish his accounting, leave in a few days, never speak about what he saw, and everyone would move on. When Elias refused, pointing out that people died there, Croft sighed as if dealing with an unreasonable child, saying people die everywhere. That's the nature of the world. Elias responded that they didn't die like this. Croft proceeded to explain what he thought would happen if Elias took those documents, asking if he really believed anyone would care or believe a bookkeeper from Richmond over the reputation of Dr. Alistair Dubois, respected physician and landowner. Elias insisted the truth speaks for itself, but Croft smiled unpleasantly, offering to tell him about truth. He revealed that the doctor was connected, had friends in New Orleans, Charleston, even Richmond, men of science, men of influence, men who understood the importance of his work. When Elias felt cold spreading through his chest and asked if there were others, Croft confirmed there were other doctors, not helping but collaborating, sharing research, funding studies. The doctor wasn't alone in his pursuits, but part of a larger effort, a network of men dedicated to advancing medical knowledge through unconventional means. When Elias called it torture, Croft rephrased it as methods that squeamish people wouldn't approve of, but methods that advance human understanding nonetheless. Elias stared at him, asking if he actually believed that. Croft replied that he believed progress requires sacrifice, that the doctor believed it too, and so did the other gentlemen who supported his work. When Elias demanded names, Croft laughed, asking if he really thought he'd provide a list of prominent physicians and academics who could be implicated, calling him even more naive than thought. Elias said he'd find them, but Croft pointed out the documents mentioned consultations and collaborations using only initials, no full names. The doctor was careful about that. Elias thought about the ledger and cryptic payment records. Croft was right. There were no names, but there were initials, dates, references that could be traced. Nevertheless, Elias declared it didn't matter, that even without names, these documents proved what happened there, proved 37 people were murdered. Croft stepped closer, urging him to think practically as a bookkeeper who deals in numbers and accounts, who understands evidence and burden of proof. He systematically dismantled Elias's case, documents that could be fabricated, specimens that could be from anyone, no witnesses, no bodies, no proof of identity for any names in the ledger. The people who worked there were gone, dismissed, scattered. The ones who remained wanted to keep their positions and wouldn't testify against a dead man's reputation or against living men who could make their lives very difficult. Elias felt the trap closing around him as Croft methodically destroyed any hope of justice. When asked what happened now, Croft said he'd take those documents and store them somewhere safe where they couldn't cause problems for anyone, and Elias would finish his work and leave, with everyone's life continuing unchanged. Elias pointed out this excluded the 37 people who died there. Croft replied they were already dead, that nothing Elias did would bring them back. When Elias insisted he could make sure they're remembered, that the world would know what happened, Croft's patience seemed to wear thin. He explained that if Elias tried to make any of this public, he'd destroy his own life in the process, being labeled a fraud and liar, someone who fabricated evidence to extort money from a dead man's estate. His reputation would be ruined, his career finished, and his mother in Richmond. Croft paused, letting the threat hang in the air. She relied on his income for her medical care, didn't she? Elias felt ice in his veins as Croft insisted he wasn't threatening anything, simply pointing out reality. If Elias took those documents and tried to expose what he thought happened, he'd be fighting powerful people with resources who could destroy him, while fighting that losing battle who would take care of his mother. Elias's hands tightened on the canvas bag as Croft extended his hand, demanding the documents, telling him to walk away, take care of his mother, live his life, the smart choice. For a long moment, Elias stood weighing his options. The chances of successfully exposing this conspiracy were slim, while the chances of destroying his own life in the attempt were high. The smart choice was to walk away. But then he thought of Audit's sister, Ara, who had gone to clean the main house and never returned, who had suffered for 9 months in this place before dying. He thought of all the names in the ledger, people who had disappeared, who had been reduced to specimens and data points. He thought of the journals full of documented cruelty written with pride by a man who believed he was advancing science. He knew he couldn't walk away. He said no quietly. Croft's expression hardened, telling him he was making a mistake. Elias replied that maybe he was, but it was his mistake to make. Croft gave him a last chance, but Elias repeated his refusal. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Croft reached into his coat. Elias didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. He threw the lantern from the desk directly at Croft, who stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face. The lantern hit the floor and shattered, spilling burning oil across the wooden boards. Fire spread instantly, racing along the old dry wood. Elias ran. He burst through the door into the darkness, clutching the canvas bag. Behind him, he heard Croft shouting. The light from the spreading fire illuminated the cypress grove in flickering orange. Elias ran south toward the main house, his boots pounding on uneven ground. He nearly fell twice, catching himself on tree trunks that materialized suddenly from the darkness. Behind him came more shouting. The fire was growing, and Croft must have gotten out because Elias heard his voice calling for help. But Elias didn't stop. He had the documents, the proof, and now he had to get off this property before Croft and anyone else came after him. He reached the main house, gasping for breath, and ran up the stairs to the study. He needed his own papers, his journal, his travel documents. He burst into the study and began shoving things into his travel bag. The canvas bag with Dubois' documents, his notes, and the ledger still hidden in the desk. He retrieved it, wrapped it in cloth, and packed it carefully. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs, fast, multiple people. He grabbed both bags and moved to the window, opened it, and looked down at the 15-foot drop to the ground below. He threw the bags out first, heard them hit the soft earth, then climbed out, hung from the windowsill, and dropped. He landed hard, rolling pain shooting through his ankle, but forced himself up, grabbed the bags, and ran toward the tree line. Behind him, lights appeared in the house and voices shouted. Elias disappeared into the darkness of the cypress grove, moving as fast as his injured ankle would allow. He didn't look back. Elias walked through the night, flinching at every sound, seeing pursuit in every shadow. His ankle throbbed with each step, but fear and determination drove him forward in equal measure. By dawn, he had reached a main road, having moved roughly south using moss on the trees as a guide. It grew thicker on the north side, an old woodsman's trick his father had taught him years ago. He needed to reach New Orleans to find someone who could help, someone with influence and resources, someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. The question was, who? As he walked, he mentally reviewed everything he knew about New Orleans, where he'd been briefly once years ago, a bustling port city, diverse and dangerous, but also home to newspapers, lawyers, abolitionists, religious leaders. Someone there would listen. Someone had to. A wagon appeared in the distance heading south. Elias flagged it down. The driver was an older man transporting vegetables to market in the city. When Elias asked if he could ride and offered to pay, the man looked at him, mud-covered, limping, clutching 2 bags desperately, and asked if he was running from something. Elias answered honestly, yes. The man appreciated the honesty, told him to get in back, cover himself with the tarp, and make no noise if they passed anyone. Elias climbed into the wagon bed, nestled between crates of turnips and sweet potatoes as the driver threw a canvas tarp over him. As they moved, Elias felt some tension leave his body. For the first time in hours, he wasn't running or exposed. He allowed himself to rest just for a moment. He must have dozed because when he next opened his eyes, the sounds had changed from the quiet of rural roads to the noise of a city. Voices, wagon wheels on cobblestones, street vendors crying their wares. The wagon stopped and the driver pulled back the tarp, announcing they were in the French Quarter as far as he went. Elias climbed out stiffly, his ankle swollen but walkable. When he tried to pay, the driver waved him off but offered advice. Whatever he was running from, don't stop running until he put it somewhere safe because men with secrets don't give up easy. Elias nodded, watched the wagon roll away, then looked around to get his bearings. He needed a lawyer, specifically an abolitionist lawyer who wouldn't be afraid of powerful men. He stopped a well-dressed man on the street, asking if he knew of any lawyers who worked with difficult cases. The man looked at him with suspicion, asking what kind of difficult. Elias replied the kind involving powerful people doing terrible things. The man studied him for a long moment before mentioning Arthur Beaumont, whose office was on Royal Street 3 blocks away, describing him as a crusader type who represented people no one else would represent, though warning he wasn't cheap. Elias said he didn't need cheap, but someone who wouldn't back down. The man agreed Beaumont was his man, though he couldn't understand why anyone would seek out that much trouble. Elias found the address on elegant Royal Street lined with townhouses featuring ornate iron balconies, a narrow 3-story building with a brass plaque reading Arthur Beaumont, attorney at law. Inside the small but well-appointed office, a young clerk sat at a desk. When Elias said he needed to see Beaumont urgently, the clerk looked him up and down, still mud-covered and disheveled, asking if he had an appointment. Elias replied that he didn't, but had evidence of multiple murders committed by a prominent Louisiana physician, which he thought qualified as urgent. The clerk's eyes widened as he disappeared through a door, returning moments later with a tall, thin man in his 40s. Arthur Beaumont had sharp eyes and graying hair, looked at Elias with frank curiosity, confirmed he was the one with evidence of murders, and led him into a private office with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk covered with legal documents. Beaumont closed the door, gestured to a chair, and told him to sit and tell everything. Elias did, speaking for nearly an hour, laying out everything he'd found. The ledger, the sanctuary, the experiments, the documentation, the conspiracy of physicians. Beaumont listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, the lawyer sat back in his chair and asked to see the documents. Elias opened the canvas bag and began removing items, the ledger, the folders, the journals, laying them out on the desk. Beaumont spent the next hour reading, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up, stating this was extraordinary and horrifying, that if genuine, and he had no reason to doubt Elias, it represented systematic torture and murder over 15 years. When Elias asked if they could expose it and bring charges, Beaumont was quiet before asking against whom. Dr. Dubois was dead, the people named in the ledger were deceased, and the other physicians who may have been involved were identified only by initials. He acknowledged the documentation itself was incredibly valuable, but explained they needed to understand what they were facing. Dubois was well connected with wealthy, powerful friends. If they tried to make this public, those people would fight back, claiming the documents were fabricated, destroying Elias's credibility, making his life hell. Elias noted that's what Croft said too. Beaumont agreed Croft wasn't wrong, just betting that Elias would choose self-preservation over justice. But he leaned forward to explain what Croft didn't understand about men like him. He'd spent his entire career fighting battles he was supposed to lose and had won more than he'd lost. Elias felt hope kindle in his chest, asking if he'd help. Beaumont said he'd do more than help. He'd make this public in a way that couldn't be suppressed. He moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder, explaining he had contacts. Journalists who would publish the story, abolitionists who would use it to demonstrate the horrors of the system that enabled it, religious leaders who would demand accountability. When Elias pointed out he'd said charges would be difficult, Beaumont clarified he meant criminal charges, but there were other forms of justice. Public outrage, historical record ensuring what happened was never forgotten and that victims were named and remembered. He spread out a map of the United States on his desk, explaining they needed to get Elias out of Louisiana. Once word spread that he'd taken these documents, people would come looking, Croft certainly, possibly, others. When asked where he should go, Beaumont pointed to Boston on the map, saying he had colleagues there, abolitionists and publishers, where Elias would be safe while they built the case and his story would reach a national audience. Beaumont explained how he'd get there, a ship leaving tomorrow morning with Beaumont arranging passage. He began writing a letter to his colleague Samuel Harrison, explaining that Elias would be delivering a package of confidential documents related to the abolitionist cause, giving him legitimate business for traveling north and making it less suspicious. Elias felt overwhelmed as everything moved so fast. When he asked about his mother in Richmond, Beaumont said they'd make arrangements for her care, that once Elias was settled in Boston, they could have her brought north if necessary. But right now the priority was getting him and these documents to safety. Beaumont finished the letter, sealed it, and handed it to Elias, explaining he'd stay there that night as the clerk lived upstairs and would make room. Tomorrow morning he'd board the ship using travel documents under a pseudonym Beaumont would provide. When Elias asked what Beaumont would do, the lawyer said he'd begin documenting everything in these records, making copies, reaching out to his network. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the story would be too widespread to suppress. He extended his hand, telling Elias he did the right thing coming there and refusing to let this be buried. These people, everyone named in the ledger, deserved to be remembered, and now they would be. Elias shook his hand, feeling something loosen in his chest, relief, hope. He wasn't alone anymore. The ship was called Morning Star, a merchant vessel running regular routes between New Orleans and Boston carrying cotton, tobacco, and manufactured goods. Elias boarded at dawn using the name on his forged travel documents, William Cooper, traveling north on business for a law firm. He kept his head down, avoided conversation, stayed in his small below-deck cabin as much as possible. The documents, the ledger, the journals, everything were hidden in a false bottom trunk Beaumont had provided. The lawyer had explained that if anyone searched his belongings, they'd find ordinary papers while the real documents were sealed beneath. The voyage took 12 days of constant worry. Every time the ship stopped at a port, Mobile, Savannah, Charleston, Elias was convinced someone would board looking for him, that Croft had somehow tracked him, that the conspiracy of physicians had mobilized to stop the documents from reaching Boston. But nothing happened. The ship sailed north and Elias remained undiscovered. He spent the time reading through the documents again, memorizing details, making notes in a separate journal as a coded record in case the originals were somehow lost. He read about Cecile, who had lasted 14 months before her body finally gave out. About Etienne, whose remarkable resilience had been documented with cold fascination. About Josiah, only 15 years old, subjected to developmental protocols that destroyed him piece by piece. About Deline, whose maternal response trials were described in terms that made Elias physically ill. About Gabriel, whose stubbornness had been seen as a challenge to break. About Audit's sister Ara, whose intelligence and understanding had made her suffering more interesting to document. 37 people, 37 lives stolen, 37 deaths that no one had mourned because no one had known. Elias made a private vow there in his tiny cabin as the ship cut through Atlantic waters. He would make sure every single name was published. Every single person would be remembered. They would not be forgotten. On the 11th day, another passenger struck up a conversation with Elias in the dining area, a middle-aged, well-dressed man with friendly eyes who asked if this was his first time to Boston. Elias nodded, keeping responses minimal. When asked if it was business or pleasure, Elias replied business for a law firm. The man said legal work was important work. That law keeps society functioning and people accountable. Though he wondered if the powerful ever truly face accountability, something in his tone made Elias look up sharply. The man was watching him with interest, noting he had the look of someone carrying something heavy, that he recognized that look having worn it himself. When Elias said he didn't know what he meant, the man replied, "Of course not," and stood to leave, but offered advice that if Elias was carrying something important that powerful people wouldn't want revealed, don't stop until it's public, because once it's public, it's much harder to suppress. He walked away, leaving Elias unsettled. Who was that man? Did he know something, or was he just making conversation? Elias returned to his cabin and didn't emerge again except for necessary meals. On the morning of the 12th day, the ship entered Boston Harbor. Elias stood on deck watching the city materialize through morning mist, church spires, brick buildings, the organized chaos of a major port. Safety, he hoped. Once the ship docked, Elias disembarked, quickly carrying his trunk and travel bag. Following Beaumont's instructions to an address in Beacon Hill, Samuel Harrison's home, an elegant townhouse on a tree-lined street, he climbed the steps and knocked. The door opened to reveal a man in his 50s with white hair and a kind face who asked if he could help. Elias said he was there to deliver a package from Arthur Beaumont in New Orleans. Recognition flashed in Harrison's eyes as he quickly invited Elias inside, closing the door behind him. Fire! Harrison led him to a study lined with books, confirming Elias was indeed Elias Thorne, explaining that Beaumont had sent a telegram yesterday saying he'd be carrying documents of vital importance that exposed systematic atrocities. When Elias confirmed this, Harrison asked to see them. Quo. Elias opened the trunk, revealed the false bottom, removed the concealed documents, and laid them out on Harrison's desk. The older man spent over an hour reading. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim, stating this was beyond anything he'd expected in scale, deliberate cruelty, and documentation. He shook his head, declaring Dr. Dubois was a monster who had help. When Elias asked if they could make this public, Harrison smiled, though there was steel in it, saying they'd do more than make it public. They'd ensure the story was printed in every abolitionist newspaper in the country, send copies to religious leaders, politicians, medical societies, making it impossible to ignore. Elias asked if there wouldn't be resistance, and Harrison confirmed enormous resistance. The medical establishment would be embarrassed. Dubois' colleagues would try to discredit them. Powerful people would push back. But they had something those people couldn't fight: primary documentation written in Dubois' own hand, with details so specific and verifiable that denial became impossible. He stood and moved to a bookshelf, pulling down a journal, asking if Elias was familiar with the Liberator. the abolitionist newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison. Harrison explained he wrote for it occasionally and promised Garrison would want this story, having been documenting the horrors of slavery for years, but this documentation of medical experiments and torture disguised as science was unprecedented. Harrison began making notes, explaining they needed to be strategic, releasing the story in stages, first the basic facts, then more detailed accounts, then the names, making sure every person in that ledger was identified and honored. Elias felt emotion welling up, thanking him for believing him. Harrison replied that he believed the documents, they spoke for themselves, but wanted Elias to understand what was coming. Once this was published, his life would change. He'd be famous and infamous with people wanting to interview him while others wanted to threaten him. He'd be celebrated as a hero by some and condemned as a liar by others. Elias said he just wanted the truth told. Harrison promised the truth would be told, but warned that truth-telling had consequences. Was he prepared for that? Elias thought about Audit asking him to bear witness, about Aura and all the others who had died in silence. Yes, he said he was prepared. 3 weeks later, the first article appeared in the Liberator with the headline, "The Sanctuary of Horrors, Medical Torture in Louisiana Exposed." Written by Garrison himself based on Elias's testimony and the documents from Belre. The article described the hidden ledger, the 37 names, the experiments, the deaths, including direct quotes from Dubois' journals, carefully selected passages demonstrating the systematic nature of the cruelty without being so graphic that newspapers would refuse to print them. It named Dr. Alistair Dubois explicitly. The response was immediate and explosive. Within days, the story was picked up by other abolitionist papers than mainstream newspapers, religious publications, medical journals. Some papers ran it as written, while others added commentary calling for investigations into similar practices at other plantations. Religious leaders preached sermons about it, and medical societies held emergency meetings. The Dubois family responded with fury, publishing letters claiming the documents were forgeries, that Elias was a fraud seeking to extort money, that their father had been a respected physician who never engaged in any improper practices. But their denials rang hollow because Garrison and Harrison had been strategic, not just publishing claims but publishing evidence, photocopies of ledger pages, transcriptions of journal entries, details so specific they could be verified. Then Harrison played his master stroke, reaching out to medical colleges where Dubois had studied and professional organizations where he'd been a member. He found records, nothing official that had ever resulted in real consequences, but records of censures, complaints, whispered concerns about Dubois' methods, enough to show a pattern. To demonstrate that people in positions of authority had known, or at least suspected something was wrong with Dr. Alistair Dubois and had done nothing. Those revelations caused a second wave of outrage. Now it wasn't just about one doctor, but about a system that had allowed him to operate with impunity, about professional organizations that had looked the other way, about powerful men who had prioritized reputation over justice. 4 weeks after the first article, Elias sat in Harrison's study reading the latest responses. Harrison held up a letter, saying it was from a physician in Charleston, Dr. Richard Carlisle, offering to testify about Dubois' practices, claiming he'd attended a private medical conference in 1850, where Dubois presented some findings and was disturbed by the presentation, but didn't speak up at the time. Elias said quietly that RC was one of the initials in the ledger, payment to RC for consultation. Harrison's eyes widened, suggesting Dr. Carlisle was either one of the collaborators or trying to get ahead of the story by offering limited cooperation to avoid deeper investigation. Either way, they had a name now, someone connected to Dubois who could be questioned under oath. Harrison began writing, saying he'd forward this to colleagues practicing law in South Carolina to see how cooperative Dr. Carlisle really wanted to be. More letters arrived over the following weeks, some supportive, some threats. One anonymous letter claimed Elias had signed his own death warrant, that powerful people didn't forget, that he should watch his back. But other letters were from people who wanted to help, who wanted justice, who wanted to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. A letter from a former plantation worker in Louisiana who had worked briefly at Belre in 1851 remembered the sanctuary, being told never to go near it, hearing sounds from that direction at night. Sounds she'd tried to forget. She was willing to testify. A letter from a medical supply company in New Orleans showed their records of purchases made by Dr. Dubois, chemicals, instruments, equipment, all shipped to an alternate property location at Belre, documentation corroborating the ledger. A letter from an attorney in Richmond who had handled estate business for Dubois years ago found the doctor unsettling, had heard rumors, had chosen not to work with him again. Nothing concrete, but more pieces of the puzzle. Each letter, each piece of evidence, each corroboration made the story stronger, harder to dismiss, impossible to bury. 6 months after Elias had fled Belre, he sat in a Boston courthouse, not as a defendant, but as a witness. The case wasn't criminal since there was no one left to charge, but it was significant nonetheless. Several families of people who had been enslaved at Belre had filed a civil suit against the Dubois estate seeking damages. It was a long-shot legal strategy since slave owners had rarely been held financially accountable for how they treated enslaved people. But this case was different because the people named in Dubois' ledger hadn't died from disease, accident, or even routine cruelty. They had been specifically targeted, deliberately tortured, killed through systematic abuse, and there was documentation proving it. The Dubois family's attorneys argued the estate shouldn't be held responsible for a deceased owner's actions, that any claim should have been brought while Dr. Dubois was alive, that the evidence was insufficient to prove the victims' identities. But Elias testified about finding the ledger, the sanctuary, the detailed records. Audit testified about her sister, how she'd disappeared, how the family had been told she'd run away but never believed it. Other former workers from Belre testified about the atmosphere of fear, the locked building near the cypress grove, the supplies delivered there. The former medical supply company employee testified about unusual orders from Dr. Dubois for specific chemicals and instruments with no legitimate medical use. Arthur Beaumont, who had traveled from New Orleans to Boston for the trial, presented document after document, page after page of Dubois' own words condemning him beyond any doubt. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and found in favor of the plaintiffs. The Dubois estate was ordered to pay damages to the families of identified victims. The amount wasn't large since the estate had been sold off with limited money remaining. Each family received perhaps $500, but it wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement, about a court of law officially recognizing that these people had existed, had suffered, had been killed, had mattered. When the verdict was read, Audit, sitting in the back of the courtroom, wept. After the trial, Elias remained in Boston, finding work with an accounting firm specializing in estate settlements. Quiet, honest work. His mother was brought north, her medical expenses now covered by donations from abolitionist organizations who had rallied around Elias's story. He lived simply, kept his head down, but continued working with Harrison and Garrison because the story wasn't over. The ledger had contained initials and references to consultations, payments for discretion, and slowly, methodically, they began connecting those initials to real names. Dr. Richard Carlisle in Charleston was just the first. Through old correspondence found in Dubois' papers, they identified 2 more physicians who had attended his presentations, shared research, expressed interest in his methods, a professor at a Virginia medical college and a retired Army surgeon in Georgia. Both denied any wrongdoing. Both claimed they'd simply attended academic conferences. Both insisted they'd never participated in any experiments. But letters surfaced, journal entries, references in scientific publications to studies matching Dubois' work authored by these men. The evidence was circumstantial, not enough for criminal charges, but enough for public scandal, enough for medical societies to revoke memberships, enough for universities to terminate positions, enough for professional reputations to be destroyed. In 1859, Elias Thorne sat in a Boston library reading a newly published book titled The Sanctuary, A Chronicle of Medical Atrocity in the American South, written by Samuel Harrison. It told the complete story from Elias's discovery of the ledger to the trial to the ongoing investigation into Dubois' network of collaborators. But most importantly, it named every single person who had died at Belre, all 37 of them. Not just names from the ledger, but full names researched and documented through records, testimony, genealogical research. Cecile Rousseau, Eshin Bamo, Anton Dessen, Josiah Turner, Deline Lavinia, every person was given more than just a name. Harrison had included what he could discover about their lives, where they'd come from, who their families were, what had been lost when they died. They were no longer just entries in a ledger, but people remembered and honored. Elias turned to the dedication page. For the 37, may you be remembered not for how you died, but for the fact that you lived. And may your suffering bear witness to the necessity of justice, the importance of truth, and the power of one person who refuses to look away. Tears blurred his vision. He closed the book and looked out the library window. It was spring. The trees were blooming. The world continued, but in some small way it was a different world than it had been 5 years ago, because 37 people who would have been forgotten were now remembered, and a man who would have gotten away with monstrous crimes had been exposed. It wasn't perfect justice. It never could, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough. In the winter of 1861, as the country tore itself apart over slavery and the Civil War began to rage, Elias received a letter from Audette. She was still in Louisiana, still living in that small cabin at the edge of what had once been Belre. The plantation had been sold, and the new owners had demolished the sanctuary, wanting no connection to its terrible history. But Audette had done something first. She had gone there in those final days before it was destroyed and walked through that awful place one last time. She had found them, the specimens, the preserved remains, the glass jars with their horrible contents and neat labels. She had taken them all, every single one, and buried them properly with prayers in ground that wasn't poisoned by the man who had destroyed them. She had carved markers, simple stones with names: Ara, Cecile, Etienne, Anton, Josiah, Deline, all 37. They're at rest now, Audette wrote. Together, remembered, free. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, for bearing witness, for refusing to let them be forgotten. They are at peace, and I can sleep now knowing that. Elias folded the letter carefully, thinking about that night in the sanctuary, the moment he'd realized what Dubois had done, the decision he'd made to take the documents and expose the truth. It had cost him 5 years of looking over his shoulder, 5 years of threats, 5 years of being called a liar and fraud by people who couldn't accept what the evidence so clearly showed. But it had also given him something: purpose, meaning the knowledge that he had done what was right even when it was hard. He placed Audette's letter in a wooden box where he kept important correspondence and returned to his work, because there were other stories that needed to be told, other injustices that needed to be exposed, other people whose suffering needed to be witnessed. The world was full of secrets, full of documents that were never supposed to be seen, full of truths that powerful people wanted buried. But Elias Thorne had learned something important in that study at Belre, in that terrible sanctuary, in the months and years that followed. Sometimes one person finding one hidden document is enough to start a chain of events that can't be stopped. Enough to turn silence into acknowledgement, enough to transform forgotten victims into remembered people, enough to prove that truth once brought to light can never be completely extinguished again. Certain records aren't meant to be discovered, but when they are, when someone has the courage to look at what's written there and the determination to make sure the world sees it too, everything changes. The 37 people named in Dr. Alistair Dubois' ledger had suffered and died, had been reduced to specimens and data points, but they hadn't been forgotten. In the end, being remembered, being acknowledged, being honored, being mourned, that was its own kind of justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real, and real was what mattered most.